Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 29th of July, 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. We'll also be joined by live video Skype link by David Scott. He'll be reporting from north of the border with Northern Exposure. Well, just to say that the weather in Plymouth is overcast, threatening clouds. I think we're going to get a bit of rain. Pretty classic July, and we're going to leave the weather there. Important things, Mike, gunmen on the streets, and you brought in this one yesterday, which we'll just bring up. Here we are, the Express, breaking armed police in standoff with gunmen after swooping on Surrey home. And we'd just like to introduce this one today. So we've got the Daily Mail, armed police lockdown, as a man with a gun supposedly went into a disused brewery. And it's the comments that interest us. We've got a Stephen Younger. He could be anywhere. This is so disturbing. Unfortunately, it's the way of the world these days. You're not safe anywhere. And Georgia Fletcher, who works at the same factory, said, it's normally quiet here. To have a gunman on the loose is worrying and scary. So everything is to do with scariness, but these stories don't appear to be going anywhere. We haven't got a satisfactory end to this. Was this actually a gunman? Was it somebody carrying a gun? Did the person exist?
I'm going to say that these two things were probably drills which have been put in the media and exaggerated somewhat.
Right.
But we may be coming onto this a little bit more later on.
Okay.
To reinforce this point.
So this is the fear factor being ramped up, and of course, what do we need to protect us? We need more police, more police with guns and more tasers on the streets, apparently. Well, if you want something very scary or not, look away now, because the subject is the IMF. And this one has had a little bit of debate inside the UK Column offices this morning. We've got the IMF admits a disastrous love affair with the euro, and it apologises for the immolation of Greece. So apparently the International Monetary Fund's top staff have misled their own board, made a series of calamitous misjudgments in Greece, become euphoric cheerleaders for the euro project, ignored warning signs of an impending crisis, and collectively failed to grasp an elemental concept of currency theory. I'm just going to add to that, of course, there's no worries, because as Common Purpose tells its future leaders, mistakes are normal, everybody make them, and I think we should just learn from this, Mike. Do you think?
No, they won't learn from them. They haven't learned from any mistakes they've made over the last 20 or 30, 40 years. They're not going to learn from this. They fully intended to destroy Greece. And
they've done a good job.
Yes. David, have you any thoughts on this?
Well, the IMF are wrong about everything. That's the defining characteristic. They are unable to forecast anything. They didn't see the recent crisis coming, right up to the very, very eve of the 2007-2008 crash. They were saying that everything was fine, the world economy was in robust health, it was party time. So they have zero ability to forecast problems, because they have zero ability to actually understand the economy. They're basing all of their decisions on essentially fraud.
Indeed. Okay, well, look, let's move on to, I suppose, the main story of today, which is the named person scheme. And, of course, we mentioned yesterday the Supreme Court ruling on this, and we pointed out that the Supreme Court had particularly focused on the information sharing powers, not within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. But David, you asked us just to point out a couple of other quotes from the judgment. The first thing is that a totalitarian regime tries to do is to get at the children, to distance them from the subversive, varied influence of their families, and to indoctrinate them in the ruler's view of the world. That was a pretty stark comment by the judges.
It was indeed, and this is the part of the judgment that dare not speak its name in government circles. it goes on. It's the factual premise is that people are different from one another. No person is completely identical to another. Every person is a world in himself. Society is based on people who are different from one another. Only the worst dictatorships try to eradicate these differences. And they also quote from American courts, "is the fundamental theory of liberty upon which all governments in this union repose excludes any general power of the state to standardize its children by forcing them to accept instruction from public teachers only. The child is not the mere creature of the state. Those who nurture him and direct his destiny have the right, coupled with the high duty, to recognize and prepare him for additional obligations." Now, this is absolutely key. Leslie Scott of the Times Trust, who's my wife, was on BBC Radio Scotland yesterday at lunchtime, being interviewed by John Beattie on the lunchtime show. And she did an initial piece, and they seemed very happy with that. And the editor came on, the producer came on to her to say, "Can you stay longer? We'd like to get you involved in the next piece as well," which was a debate on this with Tam Bailey, the Scots Information Commissioner. So she said yes, she would stay longer. The next thing she mentioned was to quote that part of the finding, and that was the last involvement she had with the BBC that day. It seems that mentioning the totalitarian aspects of this, which the Supreme Court has done, is absolutely not allowed in the eyes of the Scottish Government or in the eyes of the media who they control.
Well, we'll be mentioning that again in a moment, but really some of the wording in the judgment was pretty strong, David.
It was indeed. I mean, it's worth just mentioning what the judgment actually was. It says here, the Supreme Court unanimously allows the appeal on the basis of the European Court of Human Rights challenge and the EU law challenge to the extent it mirrors the ECHR challenge. The court invites written submissions as to the terms of the order under Section 102 of the Scotland Act, which is to change the law, in order to give the Scottish Parliament and Scottish ministers an opportunity to address the matters raised in the judgment. In the meantime, since the defective provisions of Part 4 of the 2014 Act, that's the Children and Young People's Act, are not within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament, they cannot be brought into force. Lady Hale, Lord Reid, Lord Hodge, with him Lord Wilson and Lord Hughes give the joint leading judgment. So it's unanimous, and it's basically saying that the core information sharing parts of the Children and Young People's Act Section 4 named person are illegal. They contravene the European Convention on Human Rights, and they cannot be enacted by the Scottish Parliament.
Well, we have another quote here because they actually went further, didn't they? They said it would be not appropriate for this court to propose particular legislative solutions, but we can properly say the following. We do not think that amendment of the RDSG will get around the problem in conclusion B or be sufficient in itself to prevent many instances of disproportionate interference to which we refer in conclusion C. So what they basically seem to be saying here, David, is that contrary to some of the comments that we've seen from the Scottish Government, this is not a simple case of changing a couple of words.
No, the Scottish Government have been describing this as a tweak. They need a little bit of clarification. It's nothing of the sort. What this requires is new legislation, which changes the original act. Altering the guidance will not do. The court's been quite clear on that. And as you go into the depth of the judgment, you find other things. You find that, for example, the court has recognised that well-being, which is the core principle and the core objective of the whole named person scheme, well-being is not defined. Now, we've been arguing this for years. A Conservative member in the Scottish Parliament stood up and asked the SNP minister making a speech for a definition of well-being, and he was told that he was being essentially offensive. You know, how dare he make such an intervention. He needs to go and have a good look at himself. That's what he was told. Well, no one's saying that to the Supreme Court. It's quite clear that all the people arguing against the scheme have been right, in that there is no definition of well-being. It means happiness, it means anything, it means everything, it means nothing, it means whatever the state wants it to mean. Now, they're going to have to either change entirely how they're approaching this section of the Act, or they're going to have to come up with a definition of well-being, which obviously they can't do. The court also saw that the Shinari indicators were vague in the extreme and did not constitute any sort of definition. And when you look at what the named person scheme is actually about, and the named person scheme is about state control of parenting. It's about essentially nationalising parenting. It's about making it possible for the state to improve the citizenry by getting control of the next generation and making sure that they think and respond in the appropriate ways. It's that degree of control. It comes from the practical utopianism of Owen and Hugh Lanark. It comes from discredited ideas of state utopian socialism. It comes from a lot of places which are all tied up with communitarian and communist ideas of how society should be. This is where the ideas originate. And they are completely contrary to liberty and completely contrary to human thriving. And the Supreme Court has seen that, where sadly the Scottish courts had too small a perspective to see that, and they have struck it down.
Okay, well let's have a brief look at what the media was up to. Initially, most of the media coverage I saw of this was really a bit like the Scottish Daily Mail here, saying named and shamed, and the Scotsman saying court rules against Scottish government's named person policy. The National, you might not be surprising perhaps that they said work still to be done with that. Then we had the Herald front page today saying that legal action may be coming for local authorities over the named person scheme. But then we also saw stories changing. So Supreme Court rules against named person scheme according to the BBC, but at the same time, named person will still be introduced. And also the Press and Journal, Supreme Court blocks named person scheme, branding elements unlawful, when they had originally said, well, they'd used the totalitarian word. And in fact, if you look at although they've changed the headline on this story, if you look at the URL for this article on the Press and Journal website, it still contains the word totalitarian. So they've backtracked here somewhat. So there seems to be a bit of a difference in approach by the mainstream media here, David.
Yes, there does. Now, when the BBC first came out with the perfectly accurate headline that the named person has been ruled unlawful, an SNP insider tweeted out that this headline was inaccurate and the BBC would have to change it and apologise. I thought that very unlikely at the time, but sure enough, about 2 hours later, the headline was completely altered to be the very sort of soft and mediocre, well, it's all going ahead, there's nothing to see here, move along. So that says to me political pressure on the BBC. Just as Leslie Scott been taken, the interview been terminated when she mentioned the T word, totalitarian, that indicates political pressure. Now, I spoke to the Press and Journal, and they have said that there's really nothing nefarious in why they changed from totalitarian to unlawful. But we have to remember that this original post was seized upon by no less a person than the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, personally, and she tweeted out that this was terrible gutter journalism. I point out that the Press and Journal was founded in 1747 and is something like the 5th or 6th oldest newspaper in the world. So it's a little alarming to see Nicola Sturgeon suggesting it's sort of gutter journalism. But there you go, she was opposed to it, and then within a few hours the headline was, shall we say, modified. Now, what we're seeing here, and we saw this sort of during the day, it was very concerning. It was very, frankly, Orwellian. That in George Orwell's 1984 book, and if anyone from the Scottish Government is watching today, that's a warning, not an instruction manual. In that book, they had the memory hole and the tendency to change old newspaper articles in order to avoid political embarrassment with current policies. Well, we're living in the information age and everything's much faster. So what we were able to watch yesterday was the 21st century memory hole, where the information in the newspaper articles changed in real time to avoid political embarrassment.
Yes. Okay, so finally on this one then, we'll have a look at some of the social media commentary. So Barnardo's absolutely coming out pro the name person scheme staying, and in fact, they said there it's very good news that the name person legislation will go ahead following the Supreme Court ruling. I'm not quite sure how they were able to say that. We've got Alan.
Will have meanings. The Newspeak definition of very pleased is sick as a parrot. The Newspeak definition of going ahead is blocked by a court injunction. So, the words no longer have the meanings that you might remember from your youth.
Well, indeed.
If I can just interject, if I may, I just wanted to say how interesting it is that we're now seeing the full force of the child protection charities coming forward, and they certainly want to demand that the named person scheme is brought in. And at the same time, we can cover this a little bit more in the Doherty section, which we're coming up to. We've got events unfolding. You won't be aware of these, David, but apparently there's been an announcement of a substantial child abuse raid in Scotland. We'll report a little bit on that. But the child abuse charities are being identified by victims as a likely source of abusers. And yet here are these same charities saying we must have more control over everybody's child. This is a frightening scenario. It's the new form of government where we are represented by unelected charities.
Yes, the charities are not bit players in this. They're not add-ons. They are very much central to the whole scheme. And in some regards, they applied pressure to bring the government into line so that the government could use its monopoly of force to impose this upon the people of Scotland.
Okay, so just the last couple of tweets here then. Scotland's top judge, Lord Carloway, claiming that the UK Supreme Court is too distant, too remote from Scots law, and really we should probably just ignore it.
Yes, this wasn't in response to the current named person judgment, but it was a little bit older. But yes, he's suggesting that the UK Supreme Court really should mind its own business. Now, he was, of course, the judge who decided that the named person scheme was, in fact, lawful, when it is clearly not. He was the one who didn't have sufficient about him to see the threat and the danger in this, to protect the Scottish people, as was his duty. And to take the legislation down when it was in the highest court in Scotland. So I very much feel that the Scottish judiciary has failed the people here, and we're very glad we've got the Supreme Court who have had the ability and maybe the distance in perspective to see this far more clearly.
Okay, and finally, I just want to ask, is it true that Nicola Sturgeon wants the named person scheme as her parents dressed her up as a schoolboy and made her go on stage with an adult? Is that true?
This is a suggestion that Nicola Sturgeon might be somehow related to Jimmy Krankie, a suggestion that does rather follow her around for reasons which I'm sure are obvious to everybody.
Yeah, okay.
No, so I'll wait till the Doherty section.
Okay.
Mike, yeah.
Okay. So we'll move on now then to the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act in Scotland. And David, you have a letter here.
Yes, this is from the regulator down in London to a Scottish local authority. Now, the highlighted bit is really rather interesting. I wonder if you could read it out, because I don't think I have a...
Okay, it says, it seems to me that you have developed such a policy and have endeavoured to be transparent in terms of that policy by placing it in the public domain. I would point out that your media statement is erroneous and that the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Scotland Act was not created for police and counter-terrorism. The legislation was created simply to enable public authorities to have a basis in law to offend the human rights of its citizens by acting covertly in necessary and proportionate circumstances in pursuit of a legitimate cause as provided by the Regulation for Investigatory Powers Act, Scotland, so as to comply with the provisions of the European Convention on Human Rights?
So local authorities have the ability and, in fact, the duty to infringe our human rights where they consider it and the state considers it's proportional and necessary. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that you're thinking the wrong thoughts? Does that mean that you're maybe watching the wrong television news channel? Who knows? Who knows what that means? Because obviously it's very opaque, and the people who regulate it are the people who administer it, and by the nature of covert operations, you don't know if you are being surveilled. So all of this, I would suggest, is very Orwellian and very, very suspicious, and it shows how not only do we need human rights as protected in legislation, but we need to be establishing our God-given inalienable rights, including the right to be left alone to conduct our lawful business without the state interfering in how we run our lives, how we bring up our children, what we read, or what we think.
Right, well, just before we move on, I'll bring up this Register article here, which is on the same subject. It's from a few weeks ago. Spying on you using fake social media profiles, one Scots council could. It's our policy, but we would never, was their response. So a Scottish council has published a new policy paper which justifies its investigating officers creating fake accounts for snooping purposes on social media, though it denies ever having conducted such covert surveillance, and this is bordering the city of Edinburgh. This is East Lothian Council, and they produced a 9-page surveillance through social media policy document explaining how it would conduct online covert surveillance if it felt like it. So the Register gives the example of Facebook, that the document explained that its officers could utilize social media for surveillance by using a covert identity, using a false name, which, by the way, aside from anything else, is against Facebook's terms and conditions, and entering into a personal relationship with the third-party group member. So they're even willing to break contract law in order to achieve this end, it seems.
Yes, and what's the excuse? The excuse is fear, the excuse is, oh, it's terrorism, oh, it's very necessary. We are the last line of defence against whatever. It doesn't actually matter what the fear is. Right? It doesn't matter, Mike, which fear you buy, as long as you see the state, the government, the council, whatever regulator it is, as the saviour from that fear. As long as fear rules what you do, then our wise overlords seem to be reasonably content.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, let's move on to the Doherty case now. I believe there's some pretty big developments here, David, but you don't want to cover them this week. You're going to keep it for next week.
Well, yes. Things are moving at quite a pace now, and we're getting a lot of support, and I want to thank the people out there who are writing letters and who are asking questions. I want to thank the people who are providing a lot of hard work on transcribing documents and transcribing the interviews, and the people who are offering some financial help to the Dohertys. And I also want to thank the people who are providing us with information. The information is extremely interesting and has got a lot more interesting in the last 48 hours. So we'll see how it develops. We might be ready to reveal a lot of this next week. We'll have to see how we proceed. But it is moving forward, and the fact that there's a lot of people now involved in this is proving to be key.
Right, but in the meantime, you wanted to highlight this car and this number plate.
Yes, sorry, on you go.
Yes, go on.
This is a car. It's an Edinburgh registered car, a 4x4 AMG Mercedes in silver. And it was behaving very suspiciously and sort of following the Dohertys around when they were in the very remote island of Achill in the west of Ireland, and they thought it was very strange, so they noted down the number plate. Now, we don't know what was going on here. We don't know if there's anything nefarious, but if anyone knows what this car is, who owned it in 2014, 2015, or who owns it now, please let us know.
Right, so the number plate is SL14WZN.
And David, if I can just say, for people who may have joined us and they are new viewers or listeners, just in a very brief summary, what is the Doherty case and why is it so important, and how is it being investigated at the moment?
Yeah, the Doherty case is the story of a very nice young family of mum, dad, and 4 kids who were living in a remote part of rural Aberdeenshire. They were approached by a neighbour. They hadn't been there very long, neighbour they didn't know well, who offered them £25,000 for access to their disabled son, and was extremely insistent that he would have that access and they could not say no to him. They reported this to the police as an approach by a paedophile. Within 24 hours, the police had decided there was no problem, and they were trying to persuade the Dohertys that there was nothing to be concerned about. Within 1 month, not only had social services come to investigate the Dohertys' children, and the relationship and schooling of those children, but the investigation had got sufficiently concerning that the Dohertys went to have a break in Ireland and to appeal to Nicola Sturgeon and other political leaders to do something about what they felt was corruption, as a paedophile was being protected by the various organisations of the state, which seem to have been set upon this family. Now, in Ireland, they had their children subsequently seized on 2 occasions by social services, police and armed police. On the first occasion, the judge threw the entire case out and had the children returned to the family, and instructed that the information coming from Scotland, which seemed to be generating this, should not follow this family around. Those instructions were not followed, and there was a subsequent seizure of the children, and the violent seizure of the children. And the children remain in care. They're held on a whole series of temporary care orders, which are only meant to last 8 days. And the children have not been with their parents now in some 7 months. The Dohertys are no longer able to see their children because they were unwise enough to take a record of bruising on their youngest son, who was only 18 months old at the time. And this was regarded by the social services in Ireland as evidence of poor mental health. Mental health and attacks on the children are the weapons being used here to silence basically people who are brave enough to speak out against extremely criminal wrongdoing. The attempts to get political support have so far fell on entirely deaf ears. The deafest of these has been Nicola Sturgeon and Enda Kenny. And what we are doing about it is we're running an open source investigation. We're encouraging the public to provide information that is readily available on the internet or from public life, and to assist us in gathering and analysing this information, in writing to political people in power, in writing to regulators, and in writing to people who have a duty to address problems such as this, and demanding that these people do their job.
David, thank you very much for that. And I'd just like to say a public thank you to those inside Police Scotland who've decided that the time has come to speak out. Recently retired or still serving, I'm not too sure, but there is no doubt that inside Police Scotland officers are beginning to consider which side of the line they're going to be on, which is basically for truth and the law, or the protection of colleagues who are involved in the abuse of children. That's about all I can say on that one, but I think it's an important point. And then just the update. We've had a report while we've been talking in this news programme that Scottish police have announced Operation Latisse, if I pronounce that correctly. They're saying that some 500 children in Scotland have been at risk of online abuse, but they're also talking about rape, indecent images of children and the sharing of those images, as well as child abuse, grooming, and apparently 77 people have been charged. So what a fascinating situation that the police are trying to make the public believe that they are doing the right thing when paedophiles are reported, except in the case of the Dohertys, where the innocent family is penalised for simply speaking out about what's happening.
And of course, other cases such as Holly Gregg as well.
Indeed.
Okay, let's move on then. Syria. Now, a couple of days ago, we mentioned Matthew Rycroft here, who's the UK ambassador to the United Nations. If we can just put him up, please, Theo. And he was complaining about the ringing of the ring of Syrian military around Aleppo, the eastern part of Aleppo city. He was saying, as we've just heard, eastern Aleppo city is now encircled by the regime. The Castello Road, a vital route for food, medicine and supplies, is cut off. 300,000 people are now effectively besieged. Yet another humanitarian catastrophe awaits. And last night on Radio 4's PM programme, this was one of the key messages which was being sent out, that this was another humanitarian disaster. They had an overextended interview with somebody from eastern Aleppo. But as the point that Vanessa Bailey, Patrick Henningsen and we have been making, is that eastern Aleppo is where ISIS, al-Nusra and the terrorists are, where children are being beheaded. So, of course, much of the criticism of humanitarian disaster was being aimed at Assad and at Putin. So the Russians and the Syrian governments have totally outflanked this maneuver once again. And what they did was they created 4 safe corridors for people to leave the area. So anybody that was civilian or any opposition fighter who wanted to leave without their weapons could leave via one of 3 safe corridors, and a safe corridor was made available for the armed opposition, inverted commas, by that we mean terrorists, to leave. And so that situation continues, and people are starting to move away from the area at the moment. But it really, once again, completely outflanks the Western government agenda to try to demonize Russia and the Syrian government.
Listen to a little bit of YouTube of President Putin talking last night. He was addressing quite a substantial group of media people. This has taken place in the last couple of weeks. He was talking off the cuff. He was talking about the danger that Russia sees in the advancement of NATO to the Russian borders. And I've got to say, Mike, it was so different from what we see from David Cameron speaking, or British politicians or the Americans. He didn't need notes. He didn't need any prompting. He was simply talking in great detail about the situation. And then you could almost see the frustration as he said to the journalists, why is it that you cannot see the danger that's being created here? There was some real passion behind it. And whatever we say about this man, there is a huge difference, it appears to me, between President Putin and the quality of the leaders that we've currently got in UK and the USA in particular.
Yes. Now, getting back to the issue of the fear agenda that we discussed at the very beginning of the programme, Newsweek here saying, how long will the UK be spared an extremist attack? The United Kingdom threat level, they say, from international terrorism is currently set to severe. This means that the security and intelligence agencies believe that an attack is highly likely. And they say that basically, so far, the UK has been spared an attack, and they ask the question, or they say that it's difficult to know why this is the case. And of course, I would say, Brian, it's because we're being softened up by the media in preparation for it. And of course, it's not going to be an ISIS militant which does it. It's going to be somebody that's been groomed by perhaps the British security services.
Absolutely.
And here's a perfect example of how we're being softened up, because this is Martin Brunt. Now go to the Guido Fawkes website, orderorder.com, to have a look at this little piece of video, because it is fantastic. This is Martin Brunt on Sky News yesterday, and he visited a church, and he gave a little piece to camera outside the church. He walked into the church, and then it cut to him walking back out of the church. And he said, well, there were about 14 people worshipping in this church today, and there was a priest there. And then his next words were, if I were a terrorist, I could have killed them all.
Remarkable.
I could have killed them all, he said. And it is just spectacular journalism, quality journalism from Sky News. It is designed to instill fear that we can't even visit a church in the UK, because any church is a target.
I also think, Mike, that of course we've got security now in mosques. We know that Christian preachers are dangerous, so this would be an ideal opportunity to say, well, actually, we're going to have some form of security system for churches, which will, of course, help people stay out, help people stay in. But the minimum is it'll get the government into the churches, and that'll be a further control on any form of spirituality.
Mm. Okay, economic news. This is the UK balance of payments, the Pink Book, the so-called Pink Book. It has just been released today, and it was pretty spectacular that I didn't see a single mainstream news article by the time we came on the programme on this subject. Normally, as soon as the Office for National Statistics publishes any statistics, the media is all over them, but for some reason they didn't want to cover this morning. So I wonder why. Could it be the words leading to a record deficit in the balance of payments? So we're looking at £100 billion deficit in our balance of payments up till the end of 2015, largely due, according to the ONS, to UK earnings on assets overseas falling relative to the earnings of foreign investors in the UK. They say that in 2015, the UK recorded the largest current account deficit as a percentage of GDP among the G7 economies. So, David, this is a pretty spectacular situation. Not only that it's hardly being mentioned in the mainstream, but just the fact that we are in this position. Because if I believe what George Osborne had been telling me before he left his job, and what we've heard from Philip Hammond since, British economy is in sterling condition.
Yes, and what's going on here? Because if you compare the British economy to the French economy, maybe not the German, but the French and many of the other economies in the West, we're almost maybe the best-looking horse in the glue factory. We're certainly we share the same problems, but we don't share them maybe in quite such a severe degree as some other economies. Now, why are we at the bottom of this particular list? Well, this is a monetary issue. We have been printing money. It's been called quantitative easing. It's been called open market operations by the Bank of England. It's been called a lot of things, but we're printing money. It has to go somewhere. It goes abroad, and we import goods, and ultimately the money has to come back into the UK and buy some sort of sterling denominated asset. I would suggest it might be government debt.
Absolutely. So what's your prognosis?
Well, what we've actually got here is evidence of inflation. That's what we're doing. We're inflating our currency. And we're the government is artificially setting it at par with other currencies which are not so inflated, and as a result there's huge cash outflows. The only solution here would be to stop printing money, would be to stop trying to manipulate the markets. There used to be a thing called the gold standard, and this was an automatic correction here, because what would happen is if a country printed lots of paper notes and created inflation, that would draw in goods from abroad and reduce exports, and as a result there would be claims on their gold supplies from abroad, and ultimately they would have to stop printing money, or all the gold would be gone. And if the money printing was coming from bank fractional reserve banking, then the gold supplies of those banks would be reduced, and they also would have to stop inflating, and the situation would be corrected. Now, in an entirely fiat money system where we're dealing with currency wars and nothing's real anymore, it's all on the opinion of Janet Yellen and Mark Carney. There's nothing solid, there's nothing real in the economy. It's all done on essentially a kind of la-la land of imaginary money printing. We don't have any of these corrections anymore, so things get horribly out of whack.
So the key word here is carnage?
Carnage is a key word. I think we have to look at Mark Carney's policies first and foremost.
Yes. Okay.
Right, well, let's follow through how the British government can get rid of billions with no trouble at all. And we'll come back to the story of Hinkley Point Nuclear Power Station, because no sooner has the EDF deal been approved than, as it says here, nuclear fallout chaos as ministers stun the energy industry by ordering a fresh review of the new 18 billion Hinkley Point plant just hours after EDF approves the project. Well, of course, this thing was sold as the saviour of Britain's nuclear industry, a huge project, but it was going to create thousands of jobs. It was going to do wonders for the UK. This is part of the agreement, of course. The government was so keen to see the deal going ahead that it agreed to pay a mere £92.50 per megawatt hour produced for the 35 years, and that's double the going rate.
Absolutely, and we criticised this at the time, Brian, and what's really staggering about this is that EDF was still saying up until yesterday that they're concerned that this is going to bankrupt them, despite the fact that they're getting paid double.
Despite the fact they're getting paid double. Well, I think we're going to be able to understand a bit more. Let's add another quote in here. This is part of the Mail's article. Encourage people to read it. In his resignation letter to Jean-Bernard Lévy, the chief executive of EDF, Mr. Majnin, said he was disappointed that the company was moving more and more towards nuclear energy. That's encouraging for a firm that's going to build a nuclear power station. He also raised the possibility that the project could force EDF to go bankrupt, raising the prospect of the French government having to step in to rescue it, as it had another nuclear firm, Areva, earlier this year. So we get an interesting and important little prompt there, of course, because when we talk of EDF, we're really talking the French government. The French government owns 85% of EDF. So this is Britain's nuclear power industry being handed over to control of the French government, which at the moment is controlling France in a police state clampdown.
Yep.
Well, if we get into some of the details so we can see what's going on, this is a letter that we discovered on the internet. It's from the chief executive of EDF, and he's talking to the Minister for Business and Innovation and Skills. And in the letter, they're really boasting about what they're doing for Britain. So they say they're going to give the West Country 225 million. That is apparently of a £29 billion project. Now, we've heard 18 mentioned. This is where it gets interesting because nobody seems to know the exact value of the project. 60% of the construction, they claim, is going to be placed with UK firms. So this is their justification. But just think about it. This is our industry. It's being built in UK, but only 60% of the money actually comes to British firms. We've just mentioned the EDF director warning of a collapse. So that's no worries there, Mike, that the firm starts building and then goes bankrupt. And of course, this is the other point, that in with EDF, or the French government more correctly, we've got communist China providing funding for Britain's strategic infrastructure. As a military man, I'm going to say this is treason. And we can look back in history and we can see that Britain's nuclear industry really started to be ripped apart by the privatisation of the Atomic Energy Authority. So if we have a look at that letter in a little bit more detail, here's some interesting comment. So EDF says, so we are faced with the challenge of developing a new supply chain and rebuilding the UK's nuclear construction capability. So the French government has been handed the power to rebuild our industry. Well, who's done that? Well, we just need to bring a few faces up on screen, because this is the cross-party cabal that have absolutely committed treason by handing essential British infrastructure to a foreign power, namely the French.
And indeed destroying our homegrown capability in the first place.
Absolutely. So when we say who is to blame for this, here are some of the people. I've included Nick Clegg, of course. People tend to forget about him, but he played a major part, one of Leon Britton's political boys, of course. So he was a Europhile with a vengeance. So if we dig deeper, this is part of a end-of-year report for the London Power Networks plc. But if we get into this document, it's telling us very clearly of how deep EDF has got into British power distribution. So Eastern Power Networks plc, formerly EDF Energy Networks, Southeastern Power Networks, formerly EDF, London Power Networks, so it goes on and on and on, including transport. So where did this lot come together? Well, back in 2005, there was a cosy little meeting between Bill Coley, head of British Energy. He's actually an American, so of course he's got Britain's interests at heart, but they calmly discussed a takeover. Here's the man concerned, no problem at all, straight out of the States, straight into Britain's nuclear industry. And this was part of the Telegraph report here. Speculation has intensified. The government's preparing to sell its 65% stake in British Energy, divesting. And it used Deutsche Bank, Citigroup, and Merrill Lynch to review its options. Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't Deutsche Bank bankrupt?
They're all bankrupt.
They're all bankrupt. So you use a bankrupt bank in order to have a look at your nuclear industry, and we can now see the nuclear industry going bankrupt. We'll add this little bit here. This is going back to 2007. Yesterday, British Energy said earnings before interest, tax and depreciation and amortisation in the 9 months to December the 31st rose to 775 million from 462 million a year earlier, boosted by higher electricity prices. So this is the British public being utterly fleeced.
Asset stripped.
Asset stripped with the help of an American brought in. I'll pause at that point.
Yes.
We'll follow it through. Here we go. This is where it gets interesting. This was the actual dirty deal. So this is EDF agreeing to buy British Energy. This was the price, 12.5 billion. I'm calling it a treasonous deal, and I think that's correct. That allowed the French government to control 8 UK nuclear power plants. And Pierre Gadanou, EDF's chairman and chief executive, said that this would help EDF to stick to its commitment of reducing carbon emissions. So nothing about helping UK, it's just important to help the French government reduce its carbon emissions. And then British Energy chairman Sir Adrian Montague said the deal was good for shareholders, good for staff, good for the nuclear industry, and good for the country. But this same man, as reported here in the Telegraph, was not concerned at all about the extent to which UK's energy production would fall into the hands of foreigners. He thought the tie-up would be successful. What interested us is when we went having a little look at this man, his experience and expertise is so incredible that aside from now moving to the Green Investment Bank, he was also one of the key people brought in to have a look at what went wrong in Staffordshire Hospital. So there we are, nuclear power collapsing, Staffordshire Hospital collapsing, bringing Deutsche Bank collapsing. And here we've got a very important suited gentleman who apparently fixed the lot.
Excellent. Now, Mike Penning, before we talk about what Mike Penning's actually up to at the moment, give us a bit of background about Mike Penning.
Well, he's a very interesting man because he was formerly the Minister for Policing and Justice, and he's a man named in the testimony by the Metropolitan Police whistleblower, The whistleblower says that he went and met Mr. Penning personally. He told him about the abuse of children. He told them about the cover-up by police authorities, social services, charities and politicians. He was promised an investigation, but apparently Mr. Penning did nothing that we know of. What we do know is that he's refused to answer questions that the UK column has put to him, asking what he did or did not do in relation to the Met whistleblower testimony.
Well, of course, he's no longer Minister for Police because he's now been made Armed Forces Minister. So he was visiting RAF, Royal Air Force base at Marham yesterday to reassure them because obviously they're very fearful following last week's attempted kidnapping, which was it something to do with terrorism or was it not? I'm still not sure that we know the answer to that question.
I don't think we were supposed to.
No, indeed. So anyway, he was pleased to visit Marham and reassure personnel and their families that their security is of the utmost importance. And they are in constant liaison with the police and intelligence services around the country to review and amend security arrangements continually. So that's good. But then he was also, as we mentioned yesterday, we mentioned Operation Step Eagle. If we can bring that up, please, Theo. And he was also meeting the people that were taking part in this. If you remember, Step Eagle is this multinational training exercise, NATO training exercise, which is allegedly enhancing partnership and interoperability between nations. Because I mean, we're not merging national military forces at all. And they are working with Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, the US and the UK. So Brigadier Martin Gamble was there as well, and he said Exercise Step Eagle is the cornerstone of UK-Kazakhstan defence engagement and is vital in assisting their development of a capable peacekeeping force that can be deployed to UN peacekeeping operations in the future. So that's really good, and it's taking place, he says, ahead of the London Peacekeeping Ministerial on the 8th of September, so we'll keep an eye on that one as well.
Well, it's good to know that we've got an MP going to reassure the military that they can defend themselves from a terrorist attack.
Yes.
We'll remember, of course, security at military bases was all privatised, so that got rid of the real first line of defence, and we've got private firms with all that brings supposedly defending the military.
Yes. Okay, a couple of announcements. Apparently there is a protest taking place outside Number 10 this evening, 7 p.m. it begins, really demanding that the Brexit process is started immediately. Now, my understanding is that this is, at this point in time, quite a small protest, and there's some concern that there might be some agent provocateur groups turning up to this, but nonetheless, everybody's encouraged to go to that. And then finally, I just would like to give a very warm thanks to Derek. Derek will know who I'm speaking about, who gave us a fantastic donation yesterday.
And thank you to everybody that's been helping us over the last few weeks. We have been asking for help, and that help is extremely important to us, but it's coming in many forms. And the 9 postal orders was something which we particularly remember, or it might have been 10, but anyway, it was a number of postal orders. And we're going to say thank you for the donations in whatever form they come. And we know some people can only afford to send us stamps. We're not particularly asking for stamps, but that's happened in the past. And it is a small way that people have been showing their appreciation. So thank you very much for those people who've made a donation. And we'll just say, as we are going to keep saying, if you are not on a subscription at the moment, perhaps you consider doing that, because this gives us stability of a regular income. And we would very much like to expand what we're doing, and we would like to be able to give more assistance to people who would like to get their stories out. But anyway, thank you very much for that. David, any last 20 seconds from your good self north of the border?
I would just like to say a huge thank you to all of the good people and organisations and individuals involved in the No to Name Person campaign. There's much more of this fight ahead, but it was a huge win this week, and a very good line in the sand to maintain some of our God-given inalienable rights and liberties in this island. And in particular, I should highlight the role played by the Christian Institute, who have led the No to Name Person campaign steadfastly and proportionately and calmly through some very difficult times. They have they've funded all of the legal challenges. We're talking about getting on for £250,000 worth of legal costs to get this win, and their role, their leadership role, and their ability to work with a very, very broad cross section of Scottish society to make this happen really needs to be recognised.
Excellent. David, thank you very much for that. And I'll just end by saying there is a British Constitution Group meeting on Sunday. We think this is a very important one. You can find details on the British Constitution Group website. So if you're in the area and think you might be able to get there, please have a look at that. And then I'll also say that it will be myself handling the news next week. Mike, you're popping away somewhere hot and sunny, I believe. We'll leave it at that. Okay, thanks very much for joining us. We will be back at the same time on Monday. Thank you. Bye-bye.